The rain never truly stopped in the outskirts of Portland. It hung in the air like a veil, misting over the evergreens that crowded the narrow residential streets, muffling sound, blurring edges. Daniel Hargrove had grown used to it, the perpetual dampness that seeped into the wooden frames of their modest two-story house, the rhythm of droplets against windows that had become the soundtrack to his insomnia. He stood in the dimly lit living room at 2 a.m, laptop open on the coffee table, reviewing installation logs from the security system he'd spent the previous weekend mounting throughout the house. 12 cameras, kitchen, hallways, living room, his son's bedroom, bathroom entrance. Everywhere except his own room and the bathroom interior. He'd drawn that line for himself, though he wasn't sure why it mattered anymore. Privacy felt like a luxury from another life. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and that endless Oregon rain. Daniel scrolled through the camera feeds, each small window displaying grainy night vision footage of empty rooms. Nothing moved. Nothing ever did at this hour. That should have brought him comfort. It didn't. He glanced toward the staircase where darkness pooled at the top landing. Up there, in the room that used to echo with laughter and the sound of toy cars racing across hardwood, his son Ethan slept. Or tried to. Daniel never knew anymore which nights were peaceful and which ones Ethan spent staring at the ceiling, trapped inside a body that no longer obeyed him. 7 months since the break-in. 7 months since 3 men had kicked in their back door looking for prescription medications they'd heard Daniel kept after his late wife's cancer treatment. 7 months since Ethan, barely 9 years old, had been shoved down the stairs when he stumbled out of his room, half asleep and terrified. The spinal injury had been catastrophic. T6 complete. The doctors had used gentle voices and careful language, but the meaning was absolute. Ethan would never walk again. His legs were gone. His independence fractured. His childhood rewritten in an instant of senseless violence. Daniel had installed the cameras 3 weeks ago. After the second time he'd woken from a nightmare, convinced he heard footsteps downstairs. The police had caught 2 of the 3 intruders. The third was still out there, somewhere in the rain-soaked sprawl of the Pacific Northwest. Probably long gone. Probably never coming back. Probably. That word had become unbearable. He closed the laptop and rubbed his eyes. Exhaustion dragging at him like undertow. In 5 hours, his alarm would scream him awake for his shift at the logistics warehouse. 10-hour days of loading freight, managing inventory, keeping the household afloat on a single income that had never been meant to stretch this far. The medical bills alone were crushing. The modifications to the house, ramps, grab bars, the motorized lift for the stairs, had drained what little savings they'd had. And then there was Ethan's care. Daniel couldn't do it alone anymore. He'd tried for months, cutting his hours, surviving on 4 hours of sleep, learning to catheterize and manage medications and monitor for the 1,000 complications that paralysis invited. But Ethan needed more than exhaustion and good intentions. He needed consistency, patience, expertise. He needed someone who didn't carry the guilt of failing to protect him written across their face every moment of every day. So Daniel had hired Elena Petrov. She'd arrived 4 weeks ago with a worn duffel bag, a Polish accent softened by years in America, and references from 3 families who spoke of her like she was some kind of quiet miracle. Mid-40s, gray threading through dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. She lived in the converted garage apartment out back, barely more than a studio, but she'd never complained. Her contract was simple. Weekday mornings through evenings handling Ethan's care, light housekeeping, meal preparation. Weekends Daniel managed alone. She was professional, efficient, almost invisible in her competence. Daniel barely knew her. He barely knew his own son anymore, if he was honest. Ethan had retreated somewhere deep inside himself after the injury, speaking in monosyllables, avoiding eye contact, turning away whenever Daniel tried to talk about anything real. The counselor said it was normal, trauma, depression, adjustment. Give it time. But time felt like another thing Daniel was running out of. The cameras had been his compromise with the fear. If he couldn't be there every moment, at least he could see. He could monitor. He could catch any threat before it materialized, protect what he'd already failed to protect once. The irony wasn't lost on him. That surveillance had become his language of love. He climbed the stairs quietly, avoiding the 3rd step that creaked, and paused outside Ethan's door. It was cracked open, the way Ethan insisted it stay now. He couldn't bear being closed in completely. Daniel peered through the gap and saw his son's small form under the blankets, the outline of his legs motionless beneath the fabric, the wheelchair folded and waiting beside the bed like a silent sentinel. Elena had left everything organized for the morning. Medications on the nightstand with a handwritten schedule, clean clothes laid out on the dresser, a glass of water within reach. She was meticulous in ways that made Daniel feel both grateful and ashamed. Grateful for her competence, ashamed that his son needed a stranger's care more than his father's. He pulled the door almost closed again and retreated to his own room, where he lay awake until dawn, listening to the rain, reviewing mental footage of all the ways he'd failed, wondering if protection and love were even the same thing anymore. The rhythm of work consumed Daniel's days. The warehouse was vast and unforgiving, a cathedral of concrete and steel where forklifts howled and men shouted over the grinding of machinery. He moved through it mechanically, logging shipments, coordinating routes, lifting boxes until his shoulders burned, and his mind went numb enough to stop replaying the accident on an endless loop. His supervisor had stopped asking how he was doing. Everyone had. Grief and trauma had a social expiration date, Daniel had learned. After a few months, people expected you to be functioning again, or at least to stop broadcasting your brokenness where others had to witness it. So he kept his head down, worked overtime when it was offered, and came home each evening to a house that smelled like Elena's cooking. Simple, hearty meals that Ethan sometimes ate and sometimes ignored. She always had a brief report ready. Ethan's medications administered on schedule, physical therapy exercises completed, mood relatively stable. She spoke in facts, not feelings, and Daniel appreciated that. Feelings were too vast and dangerous. He rarely watched the camera footage. The system recorded continuously, storing files on a local server that would auto-delete after 30 days unless flagged for saving. Daniel had installed it for security, for the possibility of threat, not for daily review. Watching his own house like a warden monitoring cells felt like a violation of something he couldn't name. But on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks after Elena had started, he found himself unable to sleep again. It was past midnight and he'd given up on rest, padding downstairs in sweatpants and a faded t-shirt to make coffee and maybe review some work schedules. The laptop was already open, the security software interface staring back at him with its grid of camera feeds. On impulse, he clicked on the recorded footage from earlier that evening. The timestamp read 8:47 p.m., after he'd gone to bed early with a migraine, leaving Elena to handle Ethan's evening routine. Daniel scrolled through the feeds. Kitchen showed Elena cleaning dishes, living room was empty. Hallway camera captured her carrying a laundry basket upstairs. Then he clicked on Ethan's room feed. What he saw made him lean closer to the screen, brow furrowing. The camera was mounted in the upper corner, offering a wide view of the bedroom. Ethan was in his wheelchair beside the bed in his pajamas, slumped forward slightly in the posture that had become his default, shoulders curved inward, head down, the body language of someone trying to disappear. Elena stood beside him, speaking. The camera had no audio, so Daniel couldn't hear her words, but he could see her mouth moving, see the gentle way she gestured. Then she did something unexpected. She knelt down in front of Ethan, not beside him, not at his level, but below it, on her knees on the floor, looking up at him. Her hands rested on the arms of his wheelchair, and she was still talking, her expression serious, intent. Ethan's head lifted slightly. His face, which Daniel had grown accustomed to seeing blank and shut down, showed something else. Confusion, maybe, or attention. Elena reached up and took Ethan's hands in hers, not in a clinical way, not like a caregiver performing a task, but like someone offering comfort. She held them for several long seconds, speaking continuously, her face animated with something Daniel couldn't quite identify from the grainy footage. Then she stood, moved to the bookshelf across the room and pulled down a children's book, one of the old ones, from before the accident, that Ethan used to love. She settled into the chair beside his bed and began reading aloud, her lips forming the words with visible expression. Ethan watched her, actually watched, his eyes on her face, not staring through her the way he usually did with Daniel. After maybe 20 minutes, Daniel fast-forwarded through most of it. Elena closed the book and helped Ethan with his evening transfers. The routine was smooth, practiced. Wheelchair to bed, leg positioning, blanket adjustment. But before she turned off the light, she did something else that made Daniel's chest tighten. She sat on the edge of Ethan's bed and touched his forehead, brushing his hair back, the gesture unmistakably tender. Then she leaned down and pressed a kiss to the top of his head, brief, motherly, unwitnessed except by the camera's unblinking eye. She straightened, adjusted his blankets one final time, and left the room, pulling the door to its half-closed position. Daniel sat frozen in the pre-dawn darkness of his living room, the laptop's glow washing his face in cold blue light. He rewound the footage and watched it again, then a third time. Something about it disturbed him, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. The tenderness, the intimacy of those private gestures, the fact that his son responded to her in ways he no longer responded to Daniel? Or was it something else? The realization that he'd been watching something not meant for him, a moment of genuine human connection that existed outside his surveillance, outside his control, something his cameras could record but not explain. He closed the laptop harder than necessary and sat in the darkness, listening to the rain intensify against the windows, feeling like an intruder in his own home. Daniel started watching the recordings regularly after that night. Not every feed, not obsessively. He told himself it wasn't obsessive, but Ethan's room, specifically, during the evening hours when Elena handled bedtime routines. What he discovered was a pattern, a ritual, performed nightly with variations, but fundamentally consistent. Elena always knelt before speaking seriously with Ethan. She always held his hands. She always read to him, choosing books from the shelf with what seemed like deliberate care. Sometimes the old favorites, sometimes new ones Daniel didn't recognize that she must have brought herself. And she always ended the routine with that gesture of tenderness, the kiss on his forehead, the smoothing of his hair, sometimes a whispered word the camera couldn't capture. But there was more. On Tuesday evening's footage, Daniel watched Elena help Ethan with his range of motion exercises, the passive stretching that kept his paralyzed legs from developing contractures. She was thorough but gentle, narrating each movement, treating his unresponsive limbs with a reverence that made Daniel's throat constrict. She spoke to those legs as if they could hear her, as if they still belonged to the boy and deserved respect despite their betrayal. On Wednesday, the recording showed her bringing in a small portable speaker and playing music, classical piano, judging by her swaying movements, while she helped Ethan with his evening wash-up routine. She'd converted the clinical necessity into something almost ceremonial, moving slowly, deliberately, giving him time and dignity. Thursday's footage captured something that made Daniel pause the playback and sit back, disturbing in its intimacy. Elena crying. Not dramatically, but quietly, tears sliding down her face while she folded Ethan's laundry, sitting in the chair beside his bed while he slept. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, composed herself, and continued folding as if nothing had happened. As if grief for a child who wasn't hers was just part of the job. Daniel began to notice details in the live footage too, things his exhaustion and distance had previously obscured. The way Elena anticipated Ethan's needs before he voiced them, a drink of water appearing just as he reached for it, a pillow adjusted before he shifted uncomfortably, the way she'd modified his wheelchair with small foam additions for better support, unauthorized improvements she'd never mentioned, the photographs she'd printed and framed, candid shots of Ethan smiling. From when? Daniel didn't recognize them. Had she taken them herself, somehow coaxed his son into moments of lightness that Daniel thought were gone forever? On Friday evening, Daniel came home early from work, a rarity. He found Elena in the kitchen preparing dinner, classical music playing softly from her phone. She looked up startled when he entered. "Mr. Hargrove, I wasn't expecting you yet. Supervisor let me off early." He set his keys on the counter, suddenly awkward in his own kitchen. "How's Ethan?" "Good day today." He ate well at lunch, finished his exercises without complaint. She returned to chopping vegetables with practiced efficiency. "Dinner will be ready in 30 minutes. Daniel nodded, lingering. He wanted to ask something but couldn't formulate the question. How do you reach him? Why does he respond to you? What do you do in those private moments that I can't seem to replicate? "You read to him at night," he said finally. Elena's hands stilled on the knife. She glanced at him, expression carefully neutral. "Yes. He seems to enjoy it. I hope that's acceptable." "Of course. I didn't realize." Daniel felt heat rise in his face. He was admitting surveillance without admitting surveillance. "The books you choose. He used to love those." "I know. I asked him about his favorites. Early on, when he was still barely speaking to me." She resumed chopping. "Stories help. They take us out of ourselves. when ourselves become too small. There was something in her voice, a familiarity with that particular shrinking, that retreat inward. Daniel studied her profile, the gray in her dark hair, the lines around her eyes that suggested she'd done her own share of surviving. "You're very good with him," he said quietly. Elena set down the knife and turned to face him fully. Her eyes were clear, direct, containing neither pride nor false modesty. "I care about him, Mr. Hargrove. That is not the same as being good with him. But it helps." "How do you make him respond? He barely talks to me anymore." "You're his father. The weight of that is enormous right now." She spoke gently but without evasion. "You represent everything he's lost. The life before, the father who he thinks failed to protect him, the disappointment he imagines he's become in your eyes. None of that is true, but trauma doesn't care about truth." Daniel felt something crack open in his chest. "I don't think he's a disappointment." "Then you need to tell him that. Every day. Not with words about trying hard or being strong. Just tell him he's enough exactly as he is." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "He doesn't need you to fix him, Mr. Hargrove. He needs you to see him." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the simmering pot on the stove and the ever-present rain against the windows. "The cameras," Elena said suddenly, and Daniel's stomach dropped. "I know about them. I've known since the first week." He couldn't speak. "I don't mind," she continued, her voice steady. "You have every reason to be cautious. What happened to Ethan, to your family, that's a violation that doesn't heal quickly. If the cameras help you feel secure, then they serve a purpose." "I wasn't trying to spy on you," Daniel said, the words tumbling out defensive and ashamed. "I was just trying to protect what you love the only way you know how right now." Elena's expression softened. "I understand. But Mr. Hargrove, protection isn't the same as presence. Ethan doesn't need you to watch over him from a distance. He needs you to sit with him, in the mess, in the silence, in the reality of what is, not what you wish could be fixed." Daniel wanted to argue, to explain all the reasons he couldn't do that. The work schedule, the exhaustion, the way looking at his son's paralyzed legs filled him with such crushing guilt he could barely breathe. But Elena's eyes held something that stopped him. Compassion, yes, but also challenge. An invitation to do better. "I'll be upstairs if you need anything," Elena said, returning to her cooking. "Ethan's in his room doing homework." Daniel climbed the stairs slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He paused outside Ethan's door, that perpetual crack of opening that his son needed now. Through it, he could see Ethan at his adapted desk, bent over a workbook, struggling with a pencil that kept slipping from his grip. His fine motor control had been affected too, another theft Daniel catalogued nightly in his inventory of losses. He knocked softly and pushed the door open wider. Ethan glanced up, expression immediately shuddering into polite distance. "Hey, buddy." "Hey." Daniel stepped inside and settled onto the edge of the bed, the same spot Elena sat in the recordings. "Can I help with homework?" "It's fine. Elena will help later if I need it." The words landed like small stones. Daniel absorbed them, fought against the urge to retreat. "I'd like to help, if you'll let me." Ethan stared at him, suspicious of this deviation from their usual script of brief surface interactions. "Why?" "Because I miss you." The truth came out raw, unpolished. "I miss knowing what you're thinking. I miss hearing about your day. I miss being your dad in ways that matter, not just the guy who lives in the same house and worries all the time." Ethan's face did something complicated, a flash of emotion quickly suppressed. "You don't need to do this." "Do what?" "Pretend everything's normal, pretend I'm the same." His voice cracked slightly. "I know I'm not. I know I'm just this broken thing you have to take care of now." Daniel felt like he'd been punched. "Ethan, no. That's not—" "I see how you look at me," Ethan said, and now there were tears in his eyes, the first real emotion Daniel had seen in months. "Like you're sorry. Like you wish things were different. Like you can't stand what I've become." "I look at you that way because I hate that you're in pain," Daniel said, his own voice breaking. "Because I lie awake every night wishing I could trade places with you. Because watching you suffer is worse than anything I've ever experienced, and I don't know how to help you carry it." Ethan's facade crumbled completely. Sobs racked his small frame, his hands covering his face, his shoulders shaking. Daniel moved without thinking, crossing the room and kneeling the way Elena did below him, looking up, and pulled his son into his arms as carefully as he could manage. Ethan collapsed against him, crying into his shoulder with the kind of desperate release that sounded like months of held-back agony finally escaping. Daniel held him, his own tears falling into his son's hair, murmuring the things he should have been saying all along. I love you. You're my son. You're everything. You're enough. You're more than enough. They stayed like that until Ethan's sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. When Daniel finally pulled back, he kept his hands on Ethan's shoulders, looking directly into eyes that were his late wife's eyes, that carried her light even in this darkness. I'm sorry I've been so far away, Daniel said. I was so scared of losing you that I forgot you were still here. But I'm here now. I'm going to do better. Ethan nodded, wiping his face with his sleeve, looking younger and more fragile than Daniel had allowed himself to see in months. Elena says you love me. She says that's why you work so much, that you're trying to take care of us. She's right, but she's also right that I've been doing it wrong. Daniel managed a weak smile. I've been so focused on providing and protecting that I forgot about just being with you. I like Elena, Ethan said quietly. She treats me like I'm still a person, not like I'm made of glass. I know, I've seen. Daniel stopped himself. I mean, I can tell, and I'm grateful for her, but I want to be that for you too. Will you let me try? Ethan studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't healing. That would take years, maybe forever. But it was a beginning. A crack in the walls they'd both built, letting in just enough light to see each other again. The cameras stayed up, but Daniel stopped watching the recordings. Not out of principle or sudden faith, but because he realized the footage showed him nothing about the things that actually mattered. It captured movements and routines, documented care and schedules, but it couldn't record the intangible weight of human connection, the slow rebuilding of trust, the 1,000 tiny moments that constituted real presence. He rearranged his work schedule, negotiating with his supervisor for earlier shifts that let him be home by 4 p.m. The pay cut was manageable, barely, and the trade felt essential. He needed those evening hours with Ethan, needed to be the one reading bedtime stories some nights, the one helping with homework, the one navigating the complicated logistics of paralyzed bodies and adaptive equipment. Elena remained indispensable, but the dynamic shifted. She became less like a replacement parent and more like a partner in Ethan's care, teaching Daniel the techniques she'd mastered, offering suggestions gently, stepping back when father and son needed space. She never referenced their kitchen conversation directly, but her knowing glances suggested she saw the changes and approved. Mr. Hargrove, she said one evening about 3 weeks later, catching him as he came in from work. May I speak with you privately? They settled in the living room while Ethan worked on an art project at the kitchen table. Elena had introduced him to watercolors as a form of expression that didn't require precise motor control. Through the doorway, Daniel could see his son bent over paper, tongue caught between his teeth in concentration, almost like before. I wanted to give you notice, Elena began, and Daniel's heart sank. My daughter in Seattle. I've mentioned her before. She's expecting her first child in 2 months. She's having complications. High-risk pregnancy. She needs me there. Of course, Daniel said automatically, even as panic flickered through him. Family comes first. How much notice? 6 weeks. I'll stay through month's end, help you transition to someone new, or... She paused, measuring her words. Or I could train you and Ethan to manage independently. He's stronger now than you realize. So are you. Daniel looked toward the kitchen, watching his son paint with careful, deliberate strokes. The boy who'd barely spoken 3 months ago now hummed along to the music Elena kept playing, who smiled occasionally, who'd begun to talk tentatively about the future again, maybe getting a racing wheelchair, maybe trying adaptive sports, maybe. I don't know if we're ready, he admitted. You are, Elena said with quiet certainty. You've been ready for weeks. You just needed to remember how to see it. Over the following weeks, Elena gradually reduced her hours, teaching Daniel the routines she'd established, the small tricks that made care feel less clinical, how to make stretching exercises into storytelling time, the exact way to fold towels for bath transfers, which music seemed to ease Ethan's evening anxiety. She wrote everything down in a careful notebook she presented to Daniel like a sacred text, her handwriting precise and compassionate. On her last day, she made Ethan's favorite dinner, pierogies from scratch, a recipe from her childhood in Poland that had become his comfort food. They ate together, the three of them, in the kitchen that had slowly transformed from a space of mere survival into something approaching home again. After dinner, Elena helped Ethan with his evening routine one final time. Daniel watched from the doorway, not on camera but in person, present, as she knelt before his son with that same reverence she'd shown in all those recorded moments. But this time, Daniel could hear her words. "You are braver than you know," she told Ethan, holding his hands. "What happened to you was terrible, but it doesn't define you. You get to decide who you become from here. Remember that." Ethan nodded, his eyes bright with tears. "Will you come visit?" "If I can. But you'll be so busy being amazing you might not have time for old ladies like me." She smiled, touched his cheek. "Your father loves you very much, Ethan. Let him show you. Let him in. He's trying." "I know," Ethan whispered. After Elena left, her duffel bag packed and her apartment cleaned out, the house felt simultaneously emptier and more whole. Daniel sat with Ethan in his room, the boy already in bed. The routine now Daniel's responsibility entirely. "I'm going to miss her," Ethan said into the dim light. "Me too." Daniel settled into the chair Elena had occupied for months. "But we'll be okay. We've got each other." "Dad?" Ethan's voice was small. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Do you wish I'd died instead of just gotten hurt? So you wouldn't have to deal with all this?" The question detonated in the quiet room like a grenade. Daniel felt his breath catch, felt the world tilt sideways. He moved to sit on the edge of Ethan's bed, the way Elena had taught him, and took his son's hand. "Never," he said, his voice fierce with absolute conviction. "Not once. Not for a single second. Ethan, you're my son. You're my whole world. This," he gestured to encompass the wheelchair, the adapted room, the reality of their lives. "This is hard. It's so hard. But losing you would destroy me. Do you understand that?" Ethan's tears came silently, sliding down his temples into his hair. "I feel like such a burden." "You're not a burden, you're my child. Taking care of you isn't a burden, it's a privilege. Even when it's difficult, even when I'm exhausted, even when I mess up, which I will, I promise you I will, it's still a privilege." Daniel brushed tears from Ethan's face with his thumb. "I'm sorry I made you feel otherwise. I'm sorry I was so caught up in my own fear and guilt that I forgot to tell you every single day how much I love you, how grateful I am that you're alive, how much you matter. I love you too, Dad." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of reconciliation, of walls coming down, of a relationship finding its way back from the edge. Daniel leaned down and kissed his son's forehead, that gesture Elena had modeled, that language of tenderness he'd forgotten how to speak. "Can you read to me?" Ethan asked. "Like Elena used to?" Daniel selected a book from the shelf, one of the old favorites, worn from repeated readings in a different lifetime. He settled back into the chair and began to read, his voice finding the rhythm of the story, watching his son's face relax into something approaching peace. When Ethan's breathing deepened into sleep, Daniel marked the page and set the book aside. He adjusted the blankets carefully, touched his son's hair in that gesture that no longer felt foreign, and turned off the light. Downstairs, he made tea and sat at the kitchen table with Elena's notebook open before him, reading her careful notes. Tucked into the back pages, he found a letter written in her precise hand. "Mr. Hargrove, caring for Ethan these months has been an honor. I've watched you both struggle and grieve and slowly find your way back to each other. That courage, the willingness to be broken and scared and still show up, that's what love looks like when it's real. You installed cameras because you were afraid. That fear is understandable. But true protection isn't about surveillance or control. It's about presence. It's about being vulnerable enough to witness suffering you cannot fix and loving anyway. Ethan will face many challenges. So will you. But I believe you'll face them together now, which makes all the difference. Trust yourself. Trust him. Trust that love is bigger than fear, even when fear is screaming. The most important thing I can teach you is this. Healing isn't about returning to what was. It's about discovering what can be. Let yourself and Ethan become new people, shaped by this trauma but not defined by it. There's beauty waiting on the other side of acceptance. With respect and affection, Elena Daniel read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it back in the notebook. He glanced up at the small red light blinking in the corner of the kitchen, one of the 12 cameras still recording, still watching, still documenting a house that no longer needed quite so much surveillance because it had rediscovered something more powerful. Actual presence. messy and imperfect and real. He thought about Elena kneeling before Ethan night after night, performing rituals of care that no camera could truly capture. About the way love expressed itself not in grand gestures but in daily repetitions, reading stories, stretching paralyzed legs with reverence, crying privately for someone else's child, about how protection and control were not synonyms, and how the truest form of safety came from allowing others close enough to love you when you'd forgotten how. Daniel stood and walked to the security system panel. His finger hovered over the power button. 12 cameras, endless recordings, a fortress of surveillance built from fear. He didn't turn it off, not yet. Maybe someday when the fear had faded enough. But he could live with the cameras as long as he remembered they couldn't show him the things that mattered most. The weight of a hand held in comfort, the sound of laughter returning gradually, the slow unfurling of trust between a father and son who'd both been paralyzed by trauma and were learning together how to move again. Outside, the Oregon rain continued its endless descent, washing over evergreens and quiet suburban streets, dissolving nothing and everything, patient and persistent as love when it finally remembers itself. Upstairs, Ethan slept peacefully, dreaming whatever dreams children dream when they begin to believe that morning might bring something other than pain. And Daniel, standing in the kitchen of a house that had witnessed violence and healing in equal measure, finally understood that the most profound act of protection was simply this: showing up, staying present, and loving without reservation in the face of everything you cannot control. The cameras kept recording, but Daniel had stopped needing them to tell him what was real.